We are picking back up on our look at American Presbyterian history, and in today's lecture, the plan is like normal. We're going to lecture for about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion and clarifying questions afterward. And our goal is to get through the rest of the 19th century. So last week we stopped kind of right around here on the whiteboard. My hope is we can get through this, then we'll be ready to get into the 20th century next time we're together. If you've missed any of the classes, we're recording these, we're uploading them to our main podcast feed, and you can go and listen back to any episodes you might have missed or any of the ones going forward here. Let's do a little bit of a recap to get us reoriented to the board here. And the main thing, so we've already looked at everything up top here, the beginnings of the church. And now we're picking back up right at the turn of the 19th century. And one of the most important things that happened at the beginning of the 19th century was the Plan of Union. That was a plan between Presbyterians and Congregationalists to work together in planting and serving congregations that were moving west as the country began its westward expansion. And what we looked at was how that union caused a lot of issues because it tied the congregational churches and the Presbyterian churches together formally. And a lot of the congregational theology was changing during this time period as well, that especially throughout the Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s. So we talked about that. We talked about Charles Finney, a main figure of the Second Great Awakening, and a lot of the erroneous theology, some of his new measures that he brought into revivalism. We also talked about the New Divinity and New Haven theology that was coming out of the New England congregational churches, and how that theology was infiltrating and making its way into the Presbyterian Church, especially because of that Plan of Union all the way back in 1801. And from all of this, we have these two factions or schools developing within the Presbyterian Church, the Old School and the New School. And the Old School was centered around, I'll get into a bit of the differences between those two schools, but that was what we looked at last week, was the build-up to this major split that's happening in 1837 between these two schools. And just so you know on the board, if you weren't here before, what I've done is as the timeline, not the timeline, this isn't the Marvel multiverse, as these branches happen as we move along, the blue one is where we trace our history from. And you'll see that down here, the PCA. We'll get there eventually in 1973, but you can kind of use that to trace our history of our denomination back to where we've been there. So with that background, I want to talk about the Old School, New School split that happened in the middle of the 19th century. So the lead up to this split in 1834, the Old School party, they were concerned about some of the progressive theology that was infiltrating the church. They were led by the Princetonians, the Princeton Seminary guys. They had a lot of concerns about the direction of the church, about the revivalism that was taking place, about all this changes that were being made to very core doctrines of the faith. So they brought a memorial to the General Assembly in 1834. They listed several points of concern with the church, theological issues, and some suggested actions that the assembly should take. One of those actions included abrogating the 1801 Plan of Union. They saw that as a key failure in the history of the church. They wanted to get rid of it. That memorial was ultimately rejected, and the status quo was preserved for the time being. So from 1834 to 1837 now, the Old School members, ministers and churches, they're coordinating together. They're continuing to meet separately from the General Assembly to discuss the best course of action. And the New School members are doing a bunch of the same. And they'd figure out a plan of action, both sides, and they'd meet at General Assembly and they'd wage war, and we'd try to figure out who's going to win in the deliberation. Hart includes this helpful note in his history that I thought describes the church really well at this point in time, so I want to read this quote here. So it should be noted that the church members, pastors, congregations, presbyteries, and synod in the Presbyterian Church at this time were not easily identified as either old or new school. In his biography of his father, Charles Hodge, Archibald Alexander Hodge counted 4 different groups in the church, 2 being at opposite ends and clearly identified as old and new school, with the other 2 being more moderate, though having affinities with either the old or the new school. So in effect, the majority of the denomination was in the middle, with the old school party, the strict Calvinists, in hot pursuit to rid the church of the new school or the compromised Calvinists. That's how he labels them. And I thought that was helpful because it really maps out well, I think, even how differences in the denomination exist today, even in the PCA, where you have the 2 maybe extreme edges of the denomination, and then you have a large chunk just in the middle that might be leaning one way or the other. And that was certainly the case here. But we did have these 2, there were very 2 strong factions in the church. So let's get to the 1837 General Assembly. The 4 major issues that were stemming from the Second Great Awakening: bad doctrine, church polity, revivalism, and social reform. We talked about those in the last time we were together. These main issues were leading to this unstable situation in the Presbyterian Church. There were very clear sides. The new school was led by figures like Lyman Beecher and Albert Barnes, and the old school was led by those Princetonians, Ashbel Green, Charles Hodge, R.J. Breckinridge, and others. In 1837, the church would finally and officially split. The writing was on the wall for a little while now. At that meeting in 1837, an old school moderator was elected, and the church finally was able to pass that abrogating act that they've been wanting to, which repealed the Plan of Union of 1801. And at that same General Assembly, they also passed an excising act, which made that previous act retroactive to 1801, which meant that all the churches that have been added since then, all the members, they are no longer part of the church. So they actually, by doing that, they removed 60,000 communicant members in 1837 that belonged to this part of the Plan of Union from 1801. So let's look at how these now separate churches existed in the middle of the 19th century. At this point now, we have 2 Presbyterian churches. We have an old school church and a new school church. Let's look at the new school church first. The new school was a national church, but a majority of their churches were located in the north. So already there was some geographical density. After the split in 1837, the new school, they sought to clarify their doctrinal positions. They tried to figure out, who are we as a church? What's our identity? And they started their own General Assembly. And there's a lot of back and forth that happened. There's some legal battles I'm not getting into, but basically, they separated. It's like, okay, we're on our own. So who are we? And are we Presbyterian? Is a question that they asked. And they did seek to clarify their doctrinal beliefs and their adherence to the Westminster Standards. And they did this at their first meeting after the split. They adopted what's called the Auburn Declaration. And in that Auburn Declaration, they advocated for a loose subscription to the Westminster Standards. So this kind of system subscription is what it's called. And what that maintains is that within the standards, within the Westminster Confession and Catechism, there is a system of doctrine, and that's what we're subscribing to. But there might be some disagreements or objection to various parts or phrases or wording within the standards themselves. So as long as you subscribe to whatever the system is contained therein, you can disagree with some of the different language that's used in the standards. This was a compromise position that allowed for a bigger tent within the New School Church. And this Auburn statement cited the 1729 Adopting Act that was part of the subscription controversy we looked at all the way back very early in this class. And that Adopting Act allowed for scruples that ministers could take with the standards. And really what that demonstrates is kind of how ineffective that adopting act really was in solidifying the beliefs and establishing a uniform understanding of subscription and what it means to subscribe oneself to the standards themselves. It's also interesting that after this split in 1837, the New School now began to sever ties themselves with the Congregational churches in an effort to be more explicitly Presbyterian. They felt like they had lost their way a little bit. And many figures in this controversy leading up to that point, such as Lyman Beecher, they left the New School and they took calls in other churches and in other denominations. Well, the New School, so they started doing stuff more on their own as a New School Presbyterian church without the help or the aid of the Congregationalists, even though the plan of union was still in effect for them. You know, it was the old school church who had abrogated it, and now they're off on their own. Well, that's still in effect for the New School church. But that changed, actually, when the Congregationalists met in 1852, and they did what the old school church did in 1837, which is they abrogated the plan of union from their end, from their side of things. And I love this. There's one complaint that was raised at that Congregationalist convention that really exemplified the sentiment amongst Congregationalists at that time. And they said that the Presbyterians, quote, have milked our congregational cows, but they have made nothing but Presbyterian butter and cheese. Quote. So that's how the Congregationalists felt at the end of this plan of union as well. And so they decided they're done with it as well. Union Theological Seminary in New York, we mentioned that seminary quite a bit. That was established in 1836. That served as the primary seminary for the New School church. Union is going to become, and will become, it was a bastion for liberal and progressive thought in the early 20th century. We'll see that especially as we get to the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the 20th century. But at this time, it was still somewhat mostly respected institution on both sides of the split. There were some respected professors there. So that's a bit of the New School. They're trying to develop and find their identity and move forward now as a New School Presbyterian church. Well, what about the Old School? While the New School continued to sort out its identity, the Old School Presbyterian church represented the most sustained attempt at a confessional Presbyterianism in the 19th century. Excuse me. So Princeton Seminary led the way in the Old School church during this time, especially Charles Hodge, very important name. However, there began to emerge some differences within the Old School during this time between the North, exemplified by figures like Hodge at Princeton, and in the Old School in the South, led by folks like James Henley Thornwell and others. And Thornwell, quite simply, one of the most important churchmen of the South, and he even served as the moderator of the Old School General Assembly in 1847 at only 35 years old. So he's a very important figure. Thornwell and Hodge would have some significant disagreements during this time about some of the finer points of the nature of the church and of church government. Thornwell advocated for what's called the divine right Presbyterianism, which meant that Presbyterianism is explicitly taught in Scripture and should be the polity of Scripture of the church, while Hodge acknowledged that not every aspect of our polity is expressly commanded in Scripture, but that some items are left to the light of nature, to Spirit-led decisions, to the circumstances of everyday life. Thornwell also advocated for what's called the two-office view, which is that the church has two offices, elders and deacons, and that there were two orders within the office of elder. There are teaching elders and ruling elders. Hodge, on the other hand, insisted on a three-office view, that there are three offices within the church. There's the office of deacon, and then there's the office of elder and the office of minister. So rather than taking the office of elder as one office and splitting it into two orders, both of those orders are their own offices, if that makes sense. So there's deacon, elder, and minister. I mentioned it's the finer points of, there's some peace now that the new school guys are gone. Now we can argue about the finer points of doctrine and church government. Well, I'm bringing these up because these are differences that led to real distinctions between the northern and southern Presbyterian churches that still exist today. And we'll talk more about those differences as we get into the 20th century, especially with churches like the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which is the northern church, and our church, the PCA, which is a southern church. So the PCA holds to a two-office view, where we have deacons and we have elders that are either ruling elders or teaching elders. And that's because we come from the Southern Presbyterian Church. So we have that Southern tradition, that Southern heritage that was exemplified by figures like Thornwell. One of the other doctrines that was really emerging during this time, or became maybe more prominent, is this doctrine of the spirituality of the church. And that warrants some more attention for us, especially because it's often maligned and it's often misunderstood. And unfortunately, it was used in the defending of American slavery, which we need to talk about here in a little bit as well. But Hodge summarized the spirituality of the church this way in 1861. He said, "The state has no authority in matters purely spiritual, and that the church has no authority in matters purely secular or civil. That their provinces in some cases overlie each other is indeed true. Nevertheless, the two institutions are distinct and their respective duties are different." Thornwell and other figures like Stuart Robinson in the Southern Church were proponents of this doctrine as well. And we'll flesh out some of that as we go through the class. But a while back, if you were part of the men's study, we read a book by Dr. Alan Strange called Empowered Witness, Politics, Culture, and the Spiritual Mission of the Church. I meant to bring that book down. But in that book, Dr. Strange is examining this doctrine of the spirituality of the church within this 19th century context through figures like Hodge and Thornwell. So I recommend that book if you want to learn more about that. And he talks about some of the back and forth that's taking place over what's the nature of the church, what's the mission of the church. That's the question that it's getting after. What is the church as church? What is it called to do? Well, we do need to talk about the issue of slavery within the Presbyterian Church. And all this does tie in with everything going on during this time period. So to do that, what I want to do is I've collected some statements on slavery that the Presbyterian Church produced over the decades and years. And I want to read through these so that you can get a sense of how the church was thinking about this issue, even back in the 1700s. And then once we look through those, we can see how some of those thoughts change, especially as we approach the Civil War. And that will give us some context to talk about why and how some of these views ultimately and unfortunately changed, especially amongst the Southern Church. So the first statement comes from the Synod of Philadelphia. The Synod of Philadelphia and New York. This is 1787. This is right before the First General Assembly. So this is still when they just had the Synod. And they made this statement on slavery. The Synod of New York, I'm quoting here, the Synod of New York and Philadelphia do highly approve of the general principles in favor of universal liberty that prevail in America, and the interest which many of the states have taken in promoting the abolition of slavery. They earnestly recommend it to all the members belonging to their communion to give those persons who are at present held in servitude such good education as to prepare them for the better enjoyment of freedom. And finally, they recommend it to all their people to use the most prudent measures consistent with the interests and the state of civil society in the countries where they live to procure eventually the final abolition of slavery in America. So that was in 1787. In 1815, this is after the General Assembly now exists, so the General Assembly made this statement in 1815. The General Assembly have repeatedly declared their cordial approbation of those principles of civil liberty which seem to be recognized by the federal and state governments in the United States. They have expressed their regret that the slavery of the Africans and their descendants still continues in so many places, and even among those within the pale of the church, and have urged the presbyteries under their care to adopt such measures as will secure, at least to the rising generation of slaves within the bounds of the church, religious education, that they may be prepared for the exercise and enjoyment of liberty when God in His providence may open a door for their emancipation. And then the strongest statement, anti-slavery statement, came from the General Assembly a few years later in 1818. This is important for us, a very important statement for us to consider. So the General Assembly said this: "We consider the voluntary enslaving of one part of the human race by another as a gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of human nature, as utterly inconsistent with the laws of God, which requires us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and as totally irreconcilable with the spirit and principles of the gospel of Christ. It is manifestly the duty of all Christians who enjoy the light of the present day, when the inconsistency of slavery, both with the dictates of humanity and religion, has been demonstrated and is generally acknowledged, to use their honest, earnest, and unwearied endeavors to correct the errors of former times, and as speedily as possible to efface this blot upon our holy religion, and to obtain the complete abolition of slavery throughout Christendom, and, if possible, throughout the world." I think that's an excellent statement, of course. And that was done in 1818. Unfortunately, we know that issue wasn't resolved then. So what happened here? The issue of slavery, unfortunately, was tied up with a lot of the other dividing line issues in the 1830s and 40s that would eventually separate the old school and the new school. The strict abolitionists were also those who were most willing to jettison core doctrinal and biblical truths. And it's also just one of the most tragic and unfortunate realities of history that the old school was willing, for a variety of reasons, to compromise its position that the church had adopted over these decades, to compromise its position on slavery. In 1845 and 46, so this is after the split leading up to the war, the Old School Assembly, they reaffirmed their agreement with that 1818 statement, yet at the same time, they declared that holding slaves was not a bar for Christian communion, that you could still be a member in good standing in the church if you are a slaveholder. So the Old School Assembly adopted this statement. This is 1845. The General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States was originally organized and has since continued the bond of union in the church upon the conceded principle that the existence of domestic slavery under the circumstances in which it is found in the southern portion of this country is no bar to communion. The assembly are not to be understood as denying that there is evil connected with slavery. Much less do they approve those defective and oppressive laws by which, in some of the states, it is regulated. Nor is this assembly to be understood as countenancing the idea that masters may regard their servants as mere property and not as human beings. The assembly intends simply to say that since Christ and His inspired apostles did not make the holding of slaves a bar to communion, we, as a court of the church, have no authority to do so. Now that was their statement that they realized in order to hold on to some union within the church with those who might have wanted to see the abolition of the slave trade, but they wanted to keep the church together, and they needed to appease the slaveholding members of the church at the same time. So by doing so, Hart summarizes as well that by doing so in this statement, they awkwardly tried to maintain that slavery was an evil institution, but that slaveholding itself was not a bar to communion in the church. So it's very unfortunate. Charles Hodge, he was the moderate here in the old school. His position was of gradual emancipation. And he said this, quoting him, "The question is not about the continuance of slavery and of the present system, but about the proper method of effecting the removal of the evil." And one historian summarizes that, quote, "Hodge's gradual emancipation position resonated with the majority of the old school and held their branch of Presbyterianism together until the war forced the issue of sectional separation." So I hope that gives you an idea of some of the complexities that were involved with the issue of slavery during this period of time. But now let's get into the Civil War. The issue of slavery and the increasing national tensions led to splits across all denominations. The Methodist Church divided in the 1830s, the Baptist Church divided in the 1840s over the issue of slavery. And as the Civil War approached, we have these two Presbyterian churches. We have an old school and a new school. As the Civil War is approaching, those two churches are also going to split. So from this one American Presbyterian Church, we get two churches in 1837, and then from two, we get four in the 1850s and 60s. So let's go back to the new school as they split first. The new school did not make it to the start of the Civil War, but building tensions across the nation led to a split between the northern and southern churches within the new school. So to explain this board, and please come and take a picture of it later if you need to. From new school, it's going to split, and here I just have NS for new school north, and New School South, and they split in 1857, and the same will happen for the Old School North and the Old School South. So in 1856, the New School General Assembly issued a report on the constitutional power of the General Assembly over the subject of slaveholding in our churches, which implied but did not officially act that slaveholders were not in good standing in the church. They didn't officially act yet, but around that same time, Albert Barnes, one of those leaders of the New School, he wrote a book or a work, The Church and Slavery, and he called the church to condemn slaveholding. The Southern New School churches, not as many, remember, most were in the north, but there are some Southern New School churches. They saw the writing on the wall. 1857, they met in Richmond, Virginia, and they formed a new church separate from their New School brethren. So now we have a New School church in the north and a New School church in the south. Well, the Old School remained united until the outbreak of war. So April 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter marks the beginning of the Civil War. In May of that year, the Old School General Assembly meets in Philadelphia, but many of the commissioners from the southern states are not present. At that meeting, a minister of a church in New York, his name is Gardner Spring, he brought a resolution to the General Assembly. This is known as the Spring Resolution. And that resolution proposed that the church, quote, "do all in their power to strengthen, uphold, and encourage the federal government." Spring's initial resolution was debated actually for a week, and there was many different committees and subcommittees that worked to modify the language, to perfect the language of this resolution so as not to cause a split with their southern churches within the Old School. And in fact, there's correspondence being sent back and forth between commissioners of the Old School Assembly, even to members of Lincoln's cabinet, including the Attorney General Edward Bates at the time. They're asking for advice because they want to preserve the Union, of course, but they also want to preserve the states, but also the Union of the Old School, of the church. And it seemed like the general desire of everybody involved was to preserve the Union of the church, even though the states now were divided. To that end, a subcommittee on this issue of the Spring Resolution presented a majority opinion to abstain from any further action about this resolution, to not make any statement declaring any declaration regarding the present state of the country. Yet, from this subcommittee, there was one member who submitted a minority report to the Assembly, and that minority report eventually prevailed so that the assembly voted to officially adopt this resolution, the spring resolution, with some modified language. So here I'm going to quote now. This is what the assembly adopted in 1861. It was the old school's obligation to, quote, promote and perpetuate, so far as it in us lies, the integrity of these United States, and to strengthen, uphold, and encourage the federal government in the exercise of all its functions under our noble Constitution. And to this Constitution and all its provisions, requirements, and principles, we profess our unabated loyalty. So how do you guys think the Southern commissioners in the church responded to that resolution? Some Northerners, like Charles Hodge, they were opposed to this resolution, claiming that it went beyond the scope of the church's authority, that it violated the spiritual nature of the church. But this resolution was passed overwhelmingly. So Sean Lucas in his book notes that the Southerners were placed in an awkward position of living in states that had seceded from the federal union, but belonging to a church that supported it. So they quickly resolved this tension by forming the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States on December 4th, 1861 at First Presbyterian Church in Augusta, Georgia. And so now we have 4 churches that exist, split across north and south. Well, almost immediately after these splits happen and the war breaks out, the 4 churches began to seek opportunities to reunite. And the southern branches are going to reunite first. And this is where it gets kind of tricky to follow. But in 1864, the old school South and the new school South are going to reunite, the 2 southern branches. The old school was much stronger than the new school in the South, so when reunion was done, it was along old school terms. So when it comes to subscription and to the theological doctrines, the confession, it was a more strict subscription. Subscription to Westminster Standards, pure and simple. The union was approved by the former New School presbyteries in Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. Some of the presbyteries in Tennessee were actually split. So you have these border states, some joining the Southern Old School. There's others seeking reunion with the fellow New Schoolers in the North. So it's fascinating how all this just became somewhat of a jumbled mess. But the church would become known as the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States for that final year of the war. After the war ends, they become known as the Presbyterian Church of the United States, or the PCUS. And that's the abbreviation for the Southern Presbyterian Church. The Northern Church, in 1869, the Northern New School and Northern Old School would reunite. They would reunite more along New School terms. Charles Hodge actually would object to this reunion over concerns about subscription and the compromised New School beliefs that still persisted. The New School still held to their system subscription position, which was a loose subscription that allowed for far more disagreement with the language of the standards, while the Old School was a more advocated strict subscription. Hodge didn't win the day, and the 2 churches did reunite in 1869, and they had become the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, the PCUSA. Not to be confused with the PCUSA that exists down here. We'll get to them later. I want to say something, before I say that thing, let me say this. They reunite in 1869. Hodge was against the reunion. His fears will become a reality, and we'll get to that in a moment. I do want to say, though, about the border states in the Civil War, especially because we live in one of those states, my hope is that next time we're together, I want to look at more about how the Presbyterian Church planted and grew in southwest Missouri and in the Ozarks in particular. But leading up to the reunion of the northern churches in 1869, there was a lot of debate. some of the originally northern old school churches in those border states did not want to join with the new school churches in the north because of issues that, like what Charles Hodge is bringing up. So they would leave to join the newly created southern PCUS. One history offers some more information in the aftermath of these major reunions, and there's different reunions and restructurings happening all over the place. They say that there was some continuous harassment of Southern sympathizers in Missouri and Kentucky, which finally drove the Synod of Kentucky to withdraw from the Northern Old School and to reunite with the Southern Presbyterian Church in 1869. And the Synod of Missouri joined the Southern Church in 1874. So I'm hoping to look at some more of that history in more detail next time we're together. So we've continued, we have continued lines of division happening in the decades following the end of the Civil War. Having entered the Civil War era divided between the old and new schools, American Presbyterians left the period still divided, but now according to region, not theology or polity. So that's the real big takeaway for us at this point. This original split over certain theological issues took backseat to the larger issue happening across the nation with the split between North and South. The church is split as well. And they restructure now in northern and southern, across northern and southern lines. And there would be no other reunions or there would be some other reunions and mergers with some various offshoots that we'll get to if we have time. But these two main lines now are going to exist, and they come down here. The Northern Church and the Southern Church exist until all the way up to 1983. That's where the modern-day PCUSA came from, was an eventual final reunion between the Northern and Southern churches. Well, we'll have to leave it there. We got about 5 minutes left. So there's some more stuff that happens leading up to the 20th century. We'll talk about that next time we're together. But once we get now into the 20th century, that's where a lot of the other splits take place that lead to the formation of most of the modern denominations that we know of today, like the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in the 1930s with figures like J. Gresham Machen. 1973, the formation of the Presbyterian Church in America, our home denomination, and others. So we'll get to that next time we're together, which won't be next week because we have a fellowship meal after our service and to celebrate our new officers. So it'll be the week after. And then the week after that will be Easter. And the week after that, then we'll have some regular classes where our hope is to work our way all the way up to the modern day. So I'll leave it there. We have about 5 minutes for questions. And thank you so much.